can only imagine when that day comes.
We're in Psalm 106. In that psalm, it is a praise psalm, but it's a little bit, you wouldn't think that necessarily, because the psalmist, in building to the end of the psalm, confesses the sins of the people of Israel. Because what he's going to do at the end is praise God for being so kind and so patient and so gracious and so merciful. If anybody that's thought very much has traveled that road with him, it amazes me that the Lord is patient with us as he's been. Whenever the brethren misbehave, or people misbehave, brethren, to the point that he acts dramatically, then a lot of times they're singing the blues about that. But he never comes in judgment unless it's earned. What he does is with balance. And we want to always appreciate that. And the psalmist appreciates that. Let's have a word of prayer as we begin. Father, we're thankful for this new Lord's Day. We're grateful for the opportunity to be together and fellowship and study, and later and a gracious meal. I pray that you bless our activities this day. Bless our loved ones that are far from us. Help us all to cherish each day and to recognize that life is a wonderful gift, but it's fleeting, and to make the most of it. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. We got down to verse 24 is where I am, sin number 5. We've been talked about last week. I don't know how many of these, but there was the sin of rebellion. That's verses 24 through 27 we're about to take up. That'll be followed by the sin of immorality, verse 28 through 31. Their distrust of God is going to be verses 32 and 3. Psalm 106, and then disobedience, just outright disobedience. Psalm 106, 34 through 49. So we're getting through there, but I don't want to belabor it, but I don't want us to just zip through there, because it's a thing that we ought to think about. And some of these kinds of problems that the Jews had didn't die with the Jews, did it? People sometimes can get pretty haughty and huffy, but those things kind of characterize rebellious mankind. And God continues to work with us. He just has refused for millennia to give up on humanity. And so there is intrinsic value. He said, then they departed, verse 24, from the pleasant land. Or they despised, Let me back up. Then they despised the pleasant land. They did not believe in his word, but grumbled in their tents. They did not listen to the voice of the Lord. Therefore he swore to them that he would cast them down in the wilderness, and that he would cast their seed among the nations and scatter them in the lands. Did he do that? Jews they're still scattered everywhere. A lot of Jewish people in the United States, and of course, they've been contributing to society for a long time. But you go to Memphis, you go to Houston, you start hearing those are trade centers. What are the Jews good at? Besides tearing up folks that mess with them, they're good at business. I mean, just they're some of the best in the world. And that's, not biased, I'm just looking at it. Well, here in verses 24 through 27, it describes the sin of ingratitude when it was manifested at Kadesh by Israel's lack of trust in God. When 10 of the spies returned and they had this negative assessment, God already told them, go up and take the land. And it was prudent to send out agents to look it over and to decide which is the best way to enter the land, how to attack. Did God just tell them to go be mean to those poor, sweet, benighted Canaanites? No. Some of the sorriest people that ever sucked wind. I mean, they're rough folks that he's dealing with, and he wanted them out of the land. Whose land is it? God's, isn't it? And he gave it to Israel. Can he do that? Well, he did do it. Sometimes people, they'll bewail the fact that somebody has sinned in such a way that they made themselves a legitimate object of punishment. But they didn't trust God, and when the 10 spies returned from Canaan and released this pessimistic report to the people, the nation responded with disbelief, and they chose not to attack the nations of Canaan and chose not to take the land. And verse 24, their lack of faith in God had two specifics. He said, the psalmist says, of his own people, he counts himself in that. They despised the good land, and they did not believe in his word. So the nation that he led out of Egypt through his servant Moses and Aaron, with great signs, wonders, and miracles, can you imagine? I'd like to think I'd have done better. I'd like to think if I'd been there and experienced those plagues and seen the Red Sea part, that I would have had the judgment, to try to line up with what God says as much as I know how. But they minimized the importance of the gift that God was giving them, the land of Canaan, and decided they're not going to do it. And they also revealed a lack of confidence in God's ability to keep his promises. Now, that's based on what? Nothing. Because all he's ever done for them is keep his promises to them. And so to despise the land of Palestine, the pleasant land, a choice land, he said. And of course, it's still got fertile places in it, but I don't know what it was like when they went into it. And a choice land flowing in milk and honey. And so that means that the proper value was not placed on what God had chosen for them. Of course, initially they come back and they're talking about how great the grapes are and how this and that and what, but then they get around to, but we can't take it. Well, if God tells you can take it, I remember David Baker used to say, if God tells you to butt a wall down, it is your job to get a running start and depend on him to make a hole. If God's told you to do that, then that's what we need to do, is the point he was making. And so the word translated here, despise, which means to kick against or rebel against or reject, they didn't look with gratitude and appreciation at what God was given to them. And they announced to each other a faithless conclusion. It would have been great if 10 had been positive and 2 negative, but no. And they said to each other, we've decided that we don't want it. And we're not going to take it. We don't think we can take it. Joshua and Caleb were the only 2 that said, we can take it. And you remember Caleb in his 80s is going to say, after all that has been dealt with, that I'm 80 plus years old and I'm as able to go and come from war as I ever was, and I want that mountain of Syria, because I said there's giants up there, and that's what I want to challenge. Well, soldiers will follow a guy like that anywhere. Absolutely. Yeah. That's just a characteristic of humanity. You get something, and then for a little while, that assuages the desire, and then next thing you know, well, they've heard about something somewhere else that's better, and they want that. If they get that, then they're going to be something else. Because the mercantile people, the merchants, they know exactly how to push the buttons, getting people to be greedy, really. When is it enough? When is it enough? We had a couple here a couple of weeks ago that have done well in life. But you're never going to see or hear anything from them that would indicate, that, well, we're big shots. They're just not in them. They're not that way because enough's enough. But here it is, and it's not only a sign of unbelief, it's just not doing what you're told to do. And their sin of unbelief also surfaced in the form of grumbling in their tents. They got off away from where Moses was and Aaron was, and then you could hear the grumbling. Now, nobody here ever grumbles. I know. I'm talking to people that have never thought about grumbling. Never thought about getting on the phone and calling somebody else that likes to grumble. You didn't do that. Or if you did do it, you better quit doing it. And so God's response to that was, therefore he swore to them that he would cast them down in the wilderness. In other words, you sorry cowards, you're not going to go possess the land. I'm not going to tolerate that. And so the Hebrew word for he swore to them means God raised his hand. That was, what do we do in courtrooms today? Raise your right hand. That's a sign I'm taking an oath here. Oaths are important things, brethren. It's like when people get married and sign a marriage license and get up before their community and before their brethren and promise to God that we're going to live together until death separates us. Well, then what needs to happen? Well, that oath needs to be carried out. Is what needs to happen. Because Dr. Warren, Brother Thomas B. Warren, made the point. Some of the brethren were arguing, well, you know how you can't both be married to each other if one, like when Jesus gave fornication as an opportunity for the innocent party to disengage from that. But Dr. Warren pointed out that when there's not that present, there's three involved in that covenant. There's the man, the woman, and who else? God is. That covenant was made before him and with him as an addition to your partner. And so those things, of course, are just taken lightly. We've come into a time where people just don't bother with a marriage. And, of course, the way a lot of them live their lives, I can kind of understand that because they know they're not going to honor it when they want to get up and say it. I noticed a very wealthy couple got married this week and been living together for, I don't know, a long time. And I don't know how many spouses each one of them have had in succession. But, it's just, I can't read the text and say, well, that's great. God allowed Israel, and he allows people today, but God allowed Israel to suffer the consequences of their own choices. And I've told you 1,000 times, my daddy would do that sometimes if it's something that wasn't going to be dangerous and hurtful, and y'all have never been afflicted with a case of not listening. But he'd say, sometimes he'd say, all right, go ahead and try that. What did happen every time in my case? Blew up, Well, after a while, you get the thing, this guy kind of knows what he's talking about. He's, like Daddy's 47 when I was born, so he was, not a real young man, but he'd lived a lot of life. And I wish I could talk to him today, and ask him some questions. But he swore, and many that raised the hand. The King James translates it absolutely literally. He lifted his hand against them. And so again, it's an image of a person raising his hand toward heaven in an act of swearing an oath. Israel's sin was so grievous that God raised his hand in a solemn oath to declare that they would not go into the land, that he would cast them down in the wilderness, that they would die outside the promised land, and a non-trusting faith, blatant unbelief, brought them under the disciplinary judgment of God. Worldly disbelieving hearts could not be led into the promised land God decreed. And so even in the case, however, even in this case, God's great mercy and grace is evident because he didn't destroy the entire nation. Who got to go in the land? Everybody that was what? 20 years old and under. That was the cutoff. So that gives us some idea. I think sometimes through the years we've baptized a lot of babies. You know, they go to camp and they're 9, 10, 11 years old. And we baptize them. And I wonder sometimes, I don't wonder sometimes, I wonder a lot about their ability, because they're going to answer the questions. They've been, those kids have usually been to worship and Bible school all their life. So they know the answers. But are they in a place to make that kind of commitment? Do they understand that? Are they capable of understanding that? You know, we don't let people do a number of things that we let older people do. Of course, we shouldn't let anybody do it, like drink whiskey. You know, but you can't go buy whiskey until you're of a certain age, you know, and then they figure you ought to have better sense if you hurt yourself with it. A lot of things. And so God makes the determination. He cuts it off at 20 and said, everybody that is above 20 years of age will die in this wilderness and not go into the promised land. That would have, except who? There was a couple of exceptions to that. Joshua and Caleb. Moses didn't get to go. Why was that? Well, we're going to see. He let the people make him mad, and he spoke rashly, and it dishonored God. And God said, Moses, had to hold him accountable because he's the leader. We've come into a time, it looks to me like where, if you ever notice, we've got equal justice in this country, but it's just more equal to some people than it is others. You ever notice that? And so that's just like the nations round about us. I did see where somewhere a constable, lady of all things, killed somebody driving a vehicle while drunk. And they're prosecuting her. Well, they ought to prosecute. Now, it's involuntary manslaughter, but it still needs to be addressed, because if I did that or you did that, what would happen? They'd haul you in there before a judge, and he would decide, what needs to happen. I mean, they've got laws and regulations, all that stuff. And so, but he swore to them, having raised his hand, that they were not going in, and showed his grace, and that those that are 20 or younger shall go in. It'll be a different generation. And of course, 40 years spent walking around in that wilderness, they're probably pretty tough people. In fact, they were. Everybody's in shape because they moved. In verse 27, the picture of long-range effects of disbelief here, mention is made of a later rebellion that would cause a scattering of the people. And he that would cast their seed among the nations and scatter them, verse 27, in the lands. So at a much, much later time in the wilderness period, their idolatry, persistent idolatry, and their failure to follow God's directives is going to result in Israel being led captive to pagan nations through a discipline of God. In 2 Kings, we come to that. In 2 Chronicles, and they testify to the scattering of the seed of Israel. The 10 tribes were taken where? Northern tribes. Anybody remember? They were taken to Assyria. Syrians, tough people. And then Judah and Benjamin, the southern tribes, where were they taken captive? Because 10 never made it back in any great numbers. There was Babylon. And that lasted how long? Anybody remember? 70 years. 70 years that they were going to be in another land and be captive people. Well, I don't know all about that, but I know one thing. It broke the Jews of idolatry. They had a bad problem with it for centuries. And that broke it up. They come in verses 28 through 31, or he comes, the psalmist does, to the sin of immorality. You kind of get to thinking, is there anything y'all didn't do, that you shouldn't have done? But he said they joined themselves also to Baal Peor and ate sacrifices offered to the dead. Thus they provoked him to anger with their deeds, and the plague broke out among them. Then Phinehas stood up and interposed, and so the plague was stayed, and it was reckoned to him for righteousness to all generations forever. Immorality is another sin discoloring the history of God's people. Now, understand when we're talking about that, they're not any worse than anybody else. They just had that responsibility put on them. It's a great blessing because God made a promise to their ancestor Abraham. But they, I think about the bonny hills of Scotland and what it might have been like if he'd have been there. And I know he wouldn't have lived long, because they were thoroughly pagan when Jesus was here. And so the facts in this, what the psalmist reveals, are revealed in Numbers chapter 25. They joined themselves also to Baal Peor and ate sacrifices offered to the dead. Baal Peor is the primary idol of the Moabite people. And it was worshipped, of course, at Peor. And the Israelites joined themselves or fastened themselves to this idol. They were intrigued by it for some reason. And they entered into a relationship with it, and that they began to bow down to this dead thing. And the expression they ate sacrifices offered to the dead is a figurative characterization of the worship of the dead or lifeless gods. I've seen educated, refined people bowing down to a rock. It looked like Buddha, and the one in Singapore at the great temple, he's a big fat happy Buddha. You've seen some Buddhas. This Buddha been eating lots of taters and cornbread, stuff like that. And so, but and they're serious about it. And we didn't show any disrespect, but you're welcome to come in there as long as you behave yourself. And beautiful. Absolutely gorgeous structure. But people created in the image of who? God, the real God. Bowing down to a rock or something that's dead, whatever, representation. Now, I know they say, well, we know that's not Buddha literally, but it represents Buddha. And God said what? Thou shalt not make any graven images, for I alone am God, and I'm jealous. They're intrigued by it. They enter into a relationship with it. They offer up. God's people participated in fellowship meals with the Moabites in their worship to their lustful, non-living, imaginary gods. And that participation in what's going on there is every kind of nasty vulgarity you can think of, sexually and every other way. It was involved in a lot of that kind of pagan worship. In verse 29, it says, now because of this terrible sin, God brought a plague upon them, plague of judgment. It make COVID-19 look like a picnic, casting aside their devotion to the true God. Driven by lust and sensuality, they foolishly rushed into the religion of the pagan nations. And God, jealous for the righteousness of his people, poured divine wrath upon them in the form of this deadly plague. And before that thing was checked, before Phinehas intervened, 24,000 people were dead in 2 days. In Numbers 25, verse 9, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 8, and verse 30. At this time in Israel's history, intercessory action saved the nation. It says, then Phinehas stood up and interposed so that the plague was stayed. Now, God had chosen to annihilate that whole nation unless somebody from within the congregation arose and discharged responsible corrective discipline. You know, there's instructive discipline and corrective discipline. Now it's time for corrective discipline. And unless somebody imposes that, they're gone. They're done. And so Phinehas is Aaron's grandson. Numbers 25 and verse 11. Quite a man. He interposed, or he intervened, the New International has. And the word is a word for interceding or standing between or stepping in the gap. The King James and the American Standard have he executed judgment. But that's more of an interpretation than a translation. But by putting to death a rebellious Israelite who was flaunting his fornication. That's what Phinehas did. Had a guy out there that was fornicator, and he was proud of it, and he was flaunting that before the whole congregation. Well, Phinehas interrupted that with a judicial plague, or God rather did, and before the congregation, and Phinehas interrupted the judicial plague that was spreading through the camp. And he didn't do it before 20,000 had died from it. 2 days is pretty quick movement. And God said, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned away my wrath from the sons of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not destroy the sons of Israel in my jealousy. Numbers 25 and verse 11. So there are things God's just not going to have, and that's one of them. And he intervenes, or Phinehas intervenes. And so now, you just think about today, the way people will do. How far you think you can get if somebody tried to impose any kind of real discipline in this day and time? Corrective discipline. Yeah, they'd have a wholesale rebellion. A little lady that works at the bank that I have an account with, she was disciplining her child one time. And I think she was talking to the kid in the restroom, telling her she's acting ugly, she's going to have to straighten up and all that. And some dear lady called the cops. Absolutely called the police. Of course, she said the officer came down there and looked that over and talked and asked a couple of questions. Said, "Yeah, okay, we're done." He went and got in his car. I thought that's ridiculous. And so, but this is not that kind of case. And because Phinehas acted quickly and decisively in this judgment, it was an act of judgment on his part, God extended grace to him. And it was reckoned to him for righteousness to all generations. For how long? Forever. Like Abraham. In Romans chapter 4 and verse 9, God reckoned unto him as righteous. Genesis 15 and 6. Phinehas made an appropriate response to God. His action against the sin that arose in the Israelite camp was accepted by the Lord. In return, righteousness was reckoned to him. And so a priestly position was designated for Phinehas and his descendants, and given him a great sense of reward. God said, "Behold, I have my covenant. I gave. Let me get back up. Behold, I give him my covenant of peace, and it shall be for him and his descendants after him, a covenant of perpetual priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the sons of Israel. Numbers 25, 12, and 13. Now, I'm not comparing myself to Phinehas, but I don't like it when people run the church down. That we, in my lifetime, had some brethren arise that know better than past generations, know better than the Lord, because they do things that are not authorized to be done in the worship and various things. And, and one of the things they want to do is criticize the church. I've been able, almost 38 years, to stand and preach and teach and not been muzzled, because I'm honestly kind of hard to muzzle. But I hadn't been muzzled because the leadership is the leadership we have. But I didn't build this. I stand on the shoulders of people that were here before. I didn't build this. I didn't build the little wooden building that used to stand down there where the Quick Stop is and the drugstore and stuff. I didn't organize those worship assemblies that the Moore family and a couple other families did. And all of that. Other people did that. Well, I don't have a whole lot of criticism to make of them, is where I'm getting. Were they perfect? No, they never said they were perfect. In fact, said just the opposite. But were they good? Yeah, they were real good. And we benefit from that. And so I would caution people just to be real careful. Real careful. I have a friend I went to school with, and he kind of writes some snarky little catchy things. And Brother Alan Hires is a judge. Mr. Reagan wanted him on the Supreme Court if he could have got him. And Brother Hires responded to something he said one time. He said, "You don't appear to have very much love or respect for your brethren these days." Well, boy, if Alan Hires had said that to me, I mean, you could have hit me on the end of the nose and stunned me more than that. And he wasn't saying that, Alan is debated. He's debated with some brethren on some things. He's been not hesitant at all to call out error, but with respect and consideration for his brethren in the process. The latest acronym. Well, and it was just common sense. Common sense. And I'm glad to have some people on the court that apparently got some common sense. There was I read an account kind of pursuant to that on, it was a union leader, education union leader somewhere that said, yeah, the kids do belong to us. As Hirsch would say, I mean, if I'm in that situation, that's going to get Western real fast. The kids are their parents, and the parents are responsible, and the parents need to be held to account to be responsible while I'm talking. And we're straying a little bit, but that's okay, because that was a monumental thing that they did. And I'm happy that they did that the parents do not have to allow their child to be exposed to propaganda advocating for transsexuality and all of the stuff that goes. I'll tell you what goes with it, all the stuff that God hammered here when he sent that plague. Somebody had to raise their voice. Somebody had to put it in the court. Somebody had to care enough and not just say, oh, well, or just let's wring our hands and do nothing. And I say it, there's 92 million and counting. It's more than that now. cases where innocent blood was shed in this country for money. And then sometimes the organs of those little innocent things marketed. That's outrageous. That is just outrageous. And I don't know when and I don't know where, but I know God, he lets man be on a long leash, but when he decides it's time, he can jerk it back real quick. And that's what happened here. And so a priestly position was designated. That's high cotton among the Jewish people at that time. A priestly designation for him and for his descendants because he'd honored God. God honors him. And giving him a sense of great reward, God said, "Behold, I give to him my covenant of peace. It shall be for him and his descendants after him a covenant of a perpetual priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the sons of Israel." Again, Numbers 25, 12 and 13. At the time, the Roe v. Wade decision, I know that's been reversed, but when that thing passed, and they started lying to these young women that were in trouble and, no, it's nothing. But I'm going to tell you, those girls are going to mark that day forever. They got to carry that. And I feel for them because they were lied to, and that's a terrible tragedy. But at that time, they said there was 47 million people in the country that claimed to be Christian. How would it have been if 47 million people had poured into the streets at one time, not burning anything down, but just said, no, we're not, we're not going to have it. We're not going to stand for it. You're not doing that here. Little country like Guatemala has lots of problems, lots of violence in the country, but they don't do that. They don't have that one. And there's lots of pretty little young'uns running around in Guatemala. And they want every one of them. The sin 7, distrust. They also provoked him to wrath at the waters of Meribah, so that it went hard with Moses on their account, because they were rebellious against his spirit. He spoke rashly with his lips. He got mad. Tracy and I were talking earlier in the week about the president. Said he got, she said they made him mad and he cussed. He just apparently lost himself. And he shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't have done that. But everybody here can understand that. They're just getting pushed so far. And the sin of distrust appearing in this song next was committed at Meribah, Numbers chapter 20, verses 2 through 13. And it provides the detail of this thirst-driven episode of murmuring against God. And obviously, the writer of the psalm is not concerned about presenting stuff chronologically. That's not what he's doing. He's not following that. And he can do that. That's okay. In verse 32, the people's agitation placed such a hardship upon Moses that he spoke rashly to the degree that he sinned against God in the speaking of it. They provoked him to wrath, the King James has. They angered him, adding him to the translation. The different translations deal with that. The word him is not in the Masoretic text. Of course, it's understood. And so the question is raised, well, who was provoked? Was it God or was it Moses? Well, inasmuch as God has been referenced in the immediate context by the pronouns he, his, him, in verses 23, 4, 6, and 7, and 29, it can be assumed that he's under consideration in verse 32. That's who it's been talking about. However, as the people provoked wrath, no doubt God and Moses were impacted by the provoking, with Moses being driven to act dishonorably before God and the people. You know, again, sometimes people will get in trouble with the law and they get in the court. Well, I was mad, Your Honor. I hope you're never in the court for some kind of criminal offense, but don't trot that out. I was drunk or I was mad or I was drunk and mad, because that's not going to fly. And so if you get involved in that situation, the best thing to do is just tell truth. Yeah. Ursula said, don't tell them how mad you are in case they show you how mad they are. And yeah. And these big old burly guys I got standing in that courtroom, or I remember when Brother Miller Moffitt used to be in there, and he's not a big guy. We had a revolver about that long. And he can hit with it on either hand. And he was a Marine in World War II. I told a young man popped off one time about Barney. I said, well, let me tell you something. I just turned around and told him, so let me tell you something. Barney shoots you in your good eye. So you don't know who you're talking about, He kind of toned down a little bit, but he's one of them cocky young guys. And fortunately, most of the old timers that really could do something just are merciful. They just keep on going, rather than, well, if he lives, he'll learn better, But Moses, he got mad, and he had faithfully endured so much from these people. And before, he's the one that interposed. He's the one that stood between when God, in essence, said to Moses, get your wife and babies and get away from them. I'm going to start over. And Moses said, yeah. Right? He said, don't do that, Lord. Please don't do that. Let me work with it. Because if you do that, the heathens will say you just led them out in the desert to do that. God listened to him. A man prevailed with the Lord. Didn't boss him, but he lacked the logic. Well, this time, he just gave way. The people contended with him, Numbers 20 and verse 3. And he gave way on this one occasion, so far as we know, to unbecoming and irreverent words and conduct. In verse 33, Moses, under this pressure of this very difficult moment, failed in his representation of God. Because they were rebellious against his spirit, he spoke rashly with his lips. Since the topic under consideration is what Moses did, it appears to me there the word spirit should not be capitalized, because I think in that case it's Moses' spirit that is riled up. And the Israelites' sharp tongues of discontent and unbelief caused Moses to lose control of his spirit. In his outburst, he slighted God. One of the things in the New Testament, it's a different thing, but it's kind of one of those that runs along together with it. We're told to obey them that have the rule over you, that they may do it with joy and not with grief. I have tried, and I probably haven't always been successful, but I have tried to restrain myself and not meet the elders coming across the parking lot griping about something. Because they don't like to hear that. They don't come here to hear a bunch of griping and fussing. So I don't want to be guilty of doing that. They can tell you whether or not I was okay. But people ought to think about that. And that's not that you can't raise a question. That's not you can't state a disagreement. I'm not saying that. But there's a way to do everything. And what I call yammering is not the way to do it. And so these Israelites had sharp tongues of discontent. It wasn't hard to rile them up. And so Moses, he slighted God in the fact that he smote the rock twice. What was wrong with that? It had worked before. God told him, speak to the rock. And in his anger, I don't even know if it even occurred to him, at that point. He just got loose. What the Lord had told him. Yes, sir. Yes. Yeah. 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 That's it. He took credit too. Yeah. Am I going to have to bring forth this water to you, rebellious knotheads? And the God in essence said, "What's this eye business? Moses, you never made any water, son." And so people regularly take credit for what God does, But he rebuked the congregation publicly, discrediting the Lord by leaving the impression that he and Aaron were bringing this miracle to pass. And so after gathering the assembly before the rock, Moses said, "Listen now, you rebels. Shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock?" Numbers 20 and verse 10, voicing a rebuke that this psalm characterizes as speaking rashly. And although we do not, the angel one time confronted the adversary, or one of the demons, and what did the angel say to him? You remember? It's over in Jude, I believe. It won't come to me right now, but he said, "The Lord rebuke you." He didn't step in God's role. The Lord rebuke you. So he'll deal with you. Although we don't know exactly what happened here, it's clear that Moses allowed the grumbling congregation to provoke him. And the public rashness cost Moses the privilege of leading the people, the privilege of leading the nation into Canaan. In tones of somber judgment, Numbers 20 and 12 relates, "But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you have not believed me to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them." His sin had a severe consequence, but he is not to be thought of as being barred from heaven, because Matthew chapter 17 and verse 4, when Jesus was transfigured, who showed up? Moses and Elijah. Moses, the lawgiver; Elijah, one of the great, great, great prophets of the people. We're going to look at Elijah today in 2 Kings chapter 2. Did I say that right? I think that's right. Yeah, 2 Kings. I keep wanting to call it 1 Kings, and I know better. But 2 Kings chapter 2, we'll look at some of that today. So the eighth sin was disobedience. Verses 34 through 39. I'll read that. I don't think we'll probably get to it. But it says, "Therefore, they did not destroy the peoples, and the Lord, Therefore, I'm going to get somebody else to read it if it don't straighten up. They did not destroy the peoples as the Lord commanded them." He didn't suggest it, but they mingled with the nations, and they learned their practices and served their idols, which became a snare to them. They even sacrificed, listen to this, their sons and their daughters to the demons, and shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and their daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan. And the land was polluted with the blood. Thus they became unclean in their practices and played the harlot in their deeds. That's hard to get your mind around, to me. Long way from perfect, but when God had done all of that, of course, we have the example of what God did before I rained down too hard on the Jews. I have the same Bible that tells the same story that they had. And so I need to exercise great care to discipline myself, before you undertake to discipline others. But the general sin of disobedience to the Lord's command concerning the possession of Canaan concludes the list of sins that he examines. God had given specific instructions to drive these people out or destroy them. One of the two. You know, you can leave or you can die. And they crawled up in bed with him. We'll start there next time, Lord willing.